Understanding Mule application building blocks. As we know, Mule applications are comprised of many building blocks. These are separated into categories in the Mule palette, some of which you saw in the last walkthrough: connectors, scopes, components, transformers, filters, flow control, and error handling. One specific area inside of a Mule flow are the message sources. This is the first building block of most flows that will receive new messages and place them in a queue for processing. Message sources are usually anypoint connectors. Connectors provide connectivity to external resources. This could be things like databases, protocols, or APIs. Standard protocols like HTTP, FTP, SMTP, or AMQP, or a third-party API call, calling out to things like Salesforce, Twitter, or MongoDB. Message sources are the first building block of most flows. They act as a receiver that will receive new messages and pass them on to other processors in the flow. Message sources are typically anypoint connectors. Connectors provide connectivity to external resources. Think databases, protocols, or APIs. Protocol examples could be standard ones such as HTTP, FTP, SMTP, or AMQP, and also third-party APIs, calling out to things like Salesforce, Twitter, or MongoDB. Endpoint-based connectors are either inbound or outbound endpoints in a flow. The inbound endpoints will serve as a message source for the flow for incoming requests, and outbound endpoints send information to other external systems. And these outbound endpoints can occur anywhere in the flow, whether it be in the middle or at the end. Operation-based connectors require the specification of an operation for that connector to perform. This includes most of the connectors that are not based on a standard communication protocol, like some that you see in the bottom here, such as Twitter, Hadoop, or Slack. Since you'll hear this terminology mixed a bit, let's spell it out explicitly. A connector is a Mule-specific connection to an external resource of any kind. An endpoint is usually referring to a flow-level element that is configured to receive and/or send messages from and/or to external resources. Connectors and endpoints and global elements. Now, there is another piece of this called global elements. When you drag a connector from the Mule palette, like we did with HTTP, an endpoint will be created in a flow. For most endpoints, a lot of the configuration is encapsulated in a separate global element. You may recall this when we click the plus sign with the HTTP element. The global element is a reusable object that can be used for many endpoints in the application, and often it'll define a connection to a network resource. This is a connector configuration, though it's sometimes referred to simply as a connector. As we had seen, the HTTP connector is a great example of this. We can send and receive HTTP or HTTPS requests over a selected host, port, and address. We can either be a listener or a requester depending on where our element is inside of the flow. The HTTP listener connector, which is the inbound, listens for requests that arrive at a certain address and provides an HTTP response. By default, the host is set to 0.0.0.0, which effectively just means binds to all active IP addresses, including localhost. For apps deployed to the cloud, be sure to leave this value in connectors so requests for your application domain URL are routed to the endpoint rather than just focusing on loopback inside of the machine. The HTTP request connector outbound will send HTTP requests to a certain address and receive the returned response. A more generic term for these building blocks are message processors. Message processors include connectors that connect to an external resource, scopes that will wrap a snippet of code to define fine-grained behavior in the flow, components that will execute specific logic upon a message, things like Java, JavaScript, Groovy, Python, or Ruby, transformers that will modify the values of part of a message, filters that will limit the processing of messages based on criteria that you specify, flow control, directing messages through different pathways of an application depending on content or other criteria, error handling, how you handle any errors that could occur while the message is processing.